My grandson poured juice on my dress at Christmas. Still, I smiled, even as it soaked through silk my husband once gave me with shaking hands. As the scent of cranberry crept into the seams, so did the truth. They thought I was too old to matter. While they laughed it off like a joke, I reached for something colder than napkins. My will. The same stain they made on me, I etched into paper. With names I erased, line by line. That's when I gave them a gift they never saw coming. Nothing. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Carlin stepped out of her car, feeling the cool Charleston air kiss her skin as she made her way up to the front porch of her son's house. The house was nothing special, just a suburban box with cheap vinyl siding. But the decorations were tastefully done, an overabundance of red and green that still seemed to manage a certain elegance. It was a sharp contrast to her vintage cream dress, which she had chosen carefully this morning. The silk flowed around her, a gift from her late husband, a memory that carried more weight than the holiday itself. She adjusted her scarf, a rich burgundy that matched her lipstick, and rang the doorbell. The sound echoed in the quiet of the street. Moments later, the door opened, and there stood her son's wife, Lori, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You made it," Lori said, stepping aside to let Dot in. "Try to relax this year, okay? We don't need any tension." Dot merely nodded, a tight smile tugging at her lips as she stepped across the threshold. Inside, the house was filled with the smell of roasting turkey and freshly baked pies. Brian, her grandson, sat slouched at the dining table, scrolling through his phone without so much as a glance in her direction. His eyes briefly flickered up, then quickly darted back down to the screen, a familiar disinterest hanging in the air like a cloud. Dot could feel the tension building in her chest, the kind that always seemed to wrap itself around her during these family gatherings. Lori was always so careful with her words, but there was an edge to them, a subtle reminder that Dot wasn't as essential as she once had been in this house. "Everything's ready," James said, emerging from the kitchen with a half-hearted grin. He was too soft, too passive, always avoiding conflict. The same soft-spoken man who hadn't even bothered to step in when Brian had laughed at her this morning. The family settled around the table, and the evening began as it always did. Awkwardly. Dot was used to it by now. She ignored the conversation as much as she could, focusing instead on the rhythm of the meal. The silverware clinking, the low murmur of voices, and the heat from the kitchen creeping through the room. But no matter how hard she tried, there was always an itch that she couldn't scratch, a growing irritation that had festered for years. Brian, in his usual way, slouched further down in his chair, one hand on his glass of cranberry juice. He muttered something under his breath, too low for anyone to hear. Dot didn't bother responding. Instead, she concentrated on the pie in front of her, cutting a neat slice with a steady hand. The tension built slowly, creeping in like the tide. It was Brian who broke the silence. "Grandma, do you mind?" he asked, voice dripping with mock innocence. He lifted the glass of cranberry juice in one hand as if it weighed nothing, and aimed it at her lap. Before anyone could register the move, the glass tipped over. The juice spilled across her lap in a bright, shocking splash of red. Dot froze, feeling the cold liquid seep into the fabric of her dress, staining it in ways that could never be undone. The world seemed to pause, suspended in that moment, except for Brian. He looked at her, his lips curled into a half-smile, barely trying to suppress a laugh. There was a collective gasp from the room, followed by an uncomfortable silence. Dot stood up, her hands trembling, but her face as unreadable as ever. She didn't yell, didn't scold. She simply excused herself from the table, the slight rustle of her silk dress the only sound breaking the quiet. "Don't worry about it, Mom," James mumbled, his face flushed with discomfort, but Dot could hear the weakness in his voice. It was always the same. Brian continued to scroll through his phone, his attention fully on the screen as if nothing had happened. Lori looked at Dot briefly, then took a sip of her wine, as if to say, "It's not a big deal." Dot's steps were slow and measured as she made her way to the bathroom. The soft click of the door behind her sounded like the end of something, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. The mirror reflected a woman she didn't recognize, a woman who had put up with too much, who had tolerated too long, who had allowed herself to be nothing more than a fixture in the background of her family's life. She reached for a towel, dabbing at the stain. The dress was ruined. The stain, deep and stubborn, wouldn't come out. But she didn't let it show. Dot folded the dress with careful hands, smoothing out the fabric as if handling something fragile, something precious. She slipped the dress into a bag, and when she looked back at her reflection, she felt no anger, only something much colder, something sharper. She didn't cry. Not this time. Dot knew what she had to do now, and this was only the beginning. As she left the bathroom, she could hear the faint hum of conversation from the dining room. Her family didn't know yet, but they soon would. They had underestimated her for the last time. Dot stood motionless for a moment after closing the bathroom door behind her. The cool air felt like a distant comfort as she stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. The image of the woman before her seemed strange, a sharp contrast to the woman who had walked in so carefully, so meticulously dressed, ready for a holiday that now felt like a cruel joke. Her vintage cream dress, once a symbol of elegance and fond memories, was ruined. The bright red stain spread across her lap like an accusation. The fabric, so delicate, now carried the weight of years of sacrifice, disappointment, and quiet endurance. Dot ran her fingers over the stain almost lovingly, as if she could erase it with a touch. But the juice had seeped deep, and the damage was done. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. No tears. Not now. Not ever again. Her hands moved with methodical precision, folding the dress along its seams, carefully tucking the fabric into a shopping bag. The movements were slow, deliberate. This was not a woman who rushed through anything anymore. Dot had learned the hard way that haste only led to mistakes, and she had no room for those now. She paused briefly to check her reflection again. The silence in the bathroom was deafening. She didn't even recognize the woman in the mirror, yet somehow she knew exactly who she was. The years of putting up with disrespect, of living in the shadows of others' needs, had forged something in her, a quiet, unyielding strength. James's voice filtered through the door, faint but audible, carrying the same hesitant tone it always did. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't think he'd do that." Dot didn't reply. She didn't need to. James was the kind of man who saw everything and said nothing, the kind of man who always found a way to excuse other people's bad behavior, especially his own son's. She exhaled slowly, and with a final glance at the mirror, she grabbed her coat from the hook by the door and stepped into the living room. Lori was already pouring herself another glass of wine, like nothing had happened. Her movements were smooth, practiced, as though she had no idea how deep the cut ran. She didn't even look up as Dot entered the room, only smiled softly and said, "There you are? Everything okay now?" Her voice was saccharine sweet, but the tone was as sharp as ever. She knew nothing could faze Dot, no matter how much she tried. Brian, of course, didn't acknowledge her presence either. He sat in the corner, thumb furiously scrolling through his phone as if he hadn't just thrown the contents of a glass at his grandmother. Dot watched him, her eyes narrowing just slightly. The teenager was a study in entitlement, his world revolving around the glow of his screen and his own self-importance. His expression was unreadable, but then again, he rarely made any effort to show real emotion. He was far too good at pretending nothing mattered, especially when it came to others. Dot didn't say anything to Lori or Brian. She didn't have to. The atmosphere in the room was thick with unspoken truths. She knew exactly how they saw her. An old woman who had lived her life, who was now a mere accessory in their world of self-absorption. Then, just as she was about to leave the room, Dot's phone buzzed on the coffee table. The sound sharp and clear. Wes. She reached for the phone, her fingers brushing the screen to open the message. Saw the spill. That kid has no idea. Dot felt a flicker of something. Gratitude, perhaps. Or recognition. Wes had always been there, watching from across the street, ever the silent observer. And now, just when she needed it, he had sent this simple message. He understood. He always had. She didn't respond. Not yet. But the words, the acknowledgement, filled her with something colder than she expected. A confirmation. A validation that what had happened wasn't something she should just let slide, wasn't something she should simply brush off. She closed the phone, tucking it back into her coat pocket, and looked over at Lori. You should probably check on your son, she said, her voice low and steady. Lori raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. She simply sipped her wine again, her lips curling in that plastic smile. Don't worry, Dot. It's just a little juice. He's fine. We're all fine. Dot didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had heard it all before. The platitudes, the empty reassurances, the silence that filled the space when no one wanted to acknowledge the truth. With a final glance at Brian, who was still completely absorbed in his phone, she turned and made her way out of the room. She wasn't angry. Not yet. But the sting of what had just happened would linger, like the last traces of a storm that had passed through, leaving the air thick with something unspoken. Dot made her way to the kitchen, her hands now steady, the bag with her ruined dress tucked carefully under her arm. The quiet hum of the household continued around her. But for the first time, she felt like she was on the outside looking in, and she realized, for the first time, she didn't mind. The house was quiet when Dot sat down at the old oak desk in the corner of the living room, the one her husband had once used to manage his business affairs. The same desk that had witnessed the end of so many chapters, including his. Now, it was hers. And now, it held something far more important than business letters or tax forms. Her fingers traced the edges of the folder lying in front of her, an innocuous manila envelope that, until today, had contained everything that should have been a formality, a last will and testament to close the book on her life. She had drafted it in 2017, when she was still under the false belief that the family would treat her with the dignity she deserved. Back then, she had included Brian and Lori as beneficiaries. Back then, she believed that her legacy would be respected. Her eyes settled on the cover page, where her signature had been scrawled without hesitation. She had thought, back then, that this was what it meant to protect her family, to ensure that they would have something to remember her by. But now she knew better. The weight of the pen in her hand felt like a small relief, a sense of control she hadn't felt in years. Dot flipped through the pages, skimming over the list of assets, the names, and the clauses that tied everything together. The money, the property, the heirlooms, all of it was going to the people who had treated her like an afterthought, a relic to be dealt with. Lori and Brian were to inherit the largest portion of it all. She didn't even hesitate. Her hand moved swiftly, decisively, as if the ink in her pen had a mind of its own. Brian's name was the first to go. She slashed through it with a firm stroke, a simple line that erased him from the legacy she had once considered handing over to him. Lori's name followed, though it was harder. She had once been a daughter-in-law she tolerated, then a woman who had slipped into a role that seemed comfortable enough to accept. But now? No more. She couldn't let that woman have anything. not after the way she'd turned her back on Dot time and time again. Dot wrote in the margins, "Disrespect has consequences." She stared at the words, letting them sit there in the silence. There was something so final about them, so clear. She felt no remorse, only a strange sense of satisfaction. Like finally clearing a room of dust and cobwebs after years of neglect. The act was more than symbolic, it was a reckoning. And now, as the clock ticked steadily on, Dot knew she had to make it official. She reached for her phone, the device feeling foreign in her hands. The small screen illuminated her palm as she scrolled to Nina's number, her longtime friend and the only person who had ever understood her need for precision in these matters. Dot didn't waste time. She dialed the number and listened as it rang, the sound echoing in the quiet room. When Nina answered, her voice was warm but professional. "Dot, it's been too long. How are you?" Dot's reply was quick and to the point. "I need a revision, a big one, and I want it in plain English." Nina was quiet for a moment as if gauging the tone in Dot's voice. She had known her for years, long enough to understand when something had changed in her friend's demeanor. "I'm listening," Nina finally said. "What's happened?" Dot paused, the words coming easily now. She didn't need to explain the specifics of the dinner, the juice, the years of neglect. Nina had always understood the quiet undercurrents of Dot's life, and Dot didn't have to lay everything out for her. "I'm cutting them out," Dot said, her voice firm. "Brian and Lori. They've had their chance. They're done." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Dot waited, allowing Nina the space to process. "I understand," Nina finally said, her voice steady. But there was something in it, a knowing. "I'll have the new will ready for you tomorrow. It'll be clear. No ambiguity." Dot set the phone down and looked at the document again. The words were still fresh on the page, etched with purpose. Her legacy, the inheritance that would define her final chapter, was being rewritten before her eyes. As she stood up to stretch, she noticed the envelope, tucked in the corner of her desk. It was still the same envelope that had been in the drawer for years. It had always been a placeholder, something to hold everything together. Now, it would hold nothing. Dot reached for the envelope and slid the contents into the trash, a small act of defiance. But the final act would come tomorrow. That was when the change would be official. When the world would know what she had done, what she had finally had the courage to do. The truth, written in plain English. The truth that could no longer be ignored. Dot walked to the window and looked out at the street. The world was still out there, moving, unaware of the shift that had just occurred in her home. But soon, they would know. Soon, everyone would know exactly who she was. And for the first time, Dot didn't feel like she was fading into the background. She was about to make sure no one would forget her. Not ever again. The house was quiet when Dot sat down at the old oak desk in the corner of the living room. The one her husband had once used to manage his business affairs. The same desk that had witnessed the end of so many chapters, including his. Now it was hers. And now it held something far more important than business letters or tax forms. Her fingers traced the edges of the folder lying in front of her, an innocuous manila envelope that, until today, had contained everything that should have been a formality, a last will and testament to close the book on her life. She had drafted it in 2017, when she was still under the false belief that the family would treat her with the dignity she deserved. Back then, she had included Brian and Lori as beneficiaries. Back then, she believed that her legacy would be respected. Her eyes settled on the cover page, where her signature had been scrawled without hesitation. She had thought back then that this was what it meant to protect her family, to ensure that they would have something to remember her by. But now she knew better. The weight of the pen in her hand felt like a small relief, a sense of control she hadn't felt in years. Dot flipped through the pages, skimming over the list of assets, the names, and the clauses that tied everything together. The money, the property, the heirlooms, all of it was going to the people who had treated her like an afterthought, a relic to be dealt with. Lori and Brian were to inherit the largest portion of it all. She didn't even hesitate. Her hand moved swiftly, decisively, as if the ink in her pen had a mind of its own. Brian's name was the first to go. She slashed through it with a firm stroke, a simple line that erased him from the legacy she had once considered handing over to him. Lori's name followed, though it was harder. She had once been a daughter-in-law she tolerated, then a woman who had slipped into a role that seemed comfortable enough to accept. But now? No, no more. She couldn't let that woman have anything, not after the way she'd turned her back on Dot time and time again. Dot wrote in the margins, "Disrespect has consequences." She stared at the words, letting them sit there in the silence. There was something so final about them, so clear. She felt no remorse, only a strange sense of satisfaction, like finally clearing a room of dust and cobwebs after years of neglect. The act was more than symbolic. It was a reckoning. And now, as the clock ticked steadily on, Dot knew she had to make it official. She reached for her phone, the device feeling foreign in her hands. The small screen illuminated her palm as she scrolled to Nina's number, her longtime friend and the only person who had ever understood her need for precision in these matters. Dot didn't waste time. She dialed the number and listened as it rang, the sound echoing in the quiet room. When Nina answered, her voice was warm but professional. "Dot, it's been too long. How are you?" Dot's reply was quick and to the point. "I need a revision, a big one, and I want it in plain English." Nina was quiet for a moment, as if gauging the tone in Dot's voice. She had known her for years, long enough to understand when something had changed in her friend's demeanor. "I'm listening," Nina finally said. "What's happened?" Dot paused, the words coming easily now. She didn't need to explain the specifics of the dinner, the juice, the years of neglect. Nina had always understood the quiet undercurrents of Dot's life, and Dot didn't have to lay everything out for her. "I'm cutting them out," Dot said, her voice firm. "Brian and Lori, they've had their chance. They're done." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Dot waited, allowing Nina the space to process. "I understand," Nina finally said, her voice steady, but there was something in it, a knowing. "I'll have the new will ready for you tomorrow. It'll be clear. No ambiguity." Dot set the phone down and looked at the document again. The words were still fresh on the page, etched with purpose. Her legacy, the inheritance that would define her final chapter, was being rewritten before her eyes. As she stood up to stretch, she noticed the envelope, tucked in the corner of her desk. It was still the same envelope that had been in the drawer for years. It had always been a placeholder, something to hold everything together. Now, it would hold nothing. Dot reached for the envelope and slid the contents into the trash, a small act of defiance. But the final act would come tomorrow. That was when the change would be official. When the world would know what she had done, what she had finally had the courage to do. The truth, written in plain English. The truth that could no longer be ignored. Dot walked to the window and looked out at the street. The world was still out there, moving, unaware of the shift that had just occurred in her home. But soon, they would know. Soon, everyone would know exactly who she was. And for the first time, Dot didn't feel like she was fading into the background. She was about to make sure no one would forget her. Not ever again. Dot sat at the kitchen table, the late afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across the room. The walls, lined with family photos, held the echoes of a life lived quietly, full of sacrifice, patience, and a good deal of silence. But today, silence was not what she needed. Today, her voice would be heard. She took a fresh sheet of paper, smooth and crisp beneath her fingers, and poised her pen above it. For a moment she let herself breathe, the weight of the decision still heavy in her chest. She had made the changes to the will. She had removed Brian and Lori. But something was missing. She needed them to understand, truly understand, why. Not just the cold strokes of a pen, but the truth behind it. The letter she would write would be her final word. A sharp, quiet verdict that would leave no room for misunderstanding. Dot's pen hovered, and then, without hesitation, she began. To my dear son James's wife, Lori, and my grandson Brian, I am writing to inform you of my decision regarding the distribution of my estate. As you know, I have spent a lifetime creating and maintaining what is now being passed on to those who respect it and, more importantly, respect me. Respect is the currency of legacy. You overdrew. It seems almost trivial, doesn't it? That a single moment, a spilled glass of cranberry juice, should mark the end of something so significant. But when I reflect on that moment, I realize it is the culmination of years of actions, large and small, that have led me to this decision. Let me remind you of some of those moments, Brian, the first of many that you have long ignored. When I tried to engage with you at family dinners, you turned away, absorbed in your phone, as though my presence meant nothing. I should have known then that your indifference would only deepen, that your sense of entitlement would grow to match your disregard. Lori, you, too, have done nothing but take. You have never cared for my well-being unless it suited you. Your politeness was always measured, your concern for me always a reflection of what you could gain. You've always seen my possessions as yours already, waiting for the day when they would be handed over without any true acknowledgement of the history, the memories, the sweat that went into building this life. You have both shown me, time and time again, that your relationship with me was never about love, but about ownership. And this will? It will no longer allow for that. The spilling of the juice was simply the final insult. I will not dwell on it. I will not allow this letter to be an emotional outpouring. Instead, consider it a final lesson. Your actions have consequences. I will not pretend to understand why you believe I owe you anything, but I will no longer allow you to think that my legacy is yours for the taking. I have made my decision, and it is final. Sincerely, Carlin sat back in her chair after finishing the letter, her hands still gripping the pen as though she could somehow will the words to sink into her own skin. There was no satisfaction in what she had written, only a deep, solemn certainty. This was the truth, plain and simple. She reached for the phone and dialed Nina's number. The ringing felt long, stretching out with the weight of what was to come. When Nina answered, her voice was calm, professional. Dot? I've written the letter, Dot said, her voice steady. The one that goes with the will. There was a brief silence on the other end, and then Nina spoke. Do you want me to come over and notarize it? Dot didn't hesitate. Yes, please. It needs to be part of the record. And I want it sealed. The next few minutes passed in a blur of preparations. Dot gathered the will and the letter, placing them together on the table. She signed the will first, her signature bold and unmistakable. The ink felt heavy on the page. This was no longer just ink and paper. It was the final version of a lifetime, an act of defiance against those who had misunderstood her, who had taken her for granted. She signed again, on the letter this time, right below the final words she had written. Her pen hovered over the last stroke of ink before pressing it to the page. It was done. A few minutes later, Nina arrived, stepping into the house with the same quiet, unflappable composure Dot had come to rely on. She had barely taken off her coat before Dot handed her the papers. Nina took them, her eyes scanning both the will and the letter, the weight of the decision heavy in the air between them. She looked up at Dot, who was standing, watching intently. "This is final," Nina said, her voice measured but respectful. Dot nodded. "It is." Nina placed her stamp of approval on the pages, marking them with the unmistakable seal of legality. When it was all said and done, she handed the papers back to Dot, the notarized letter now officially part of the will. "You're sure?" Nina asked again, her gaze searching Dot's face. "I'm sure," Dot replied, the finality of the words reverberating in the stillness. Nina hesitated for only a moment longer before offering a simple nod. "Then it's done. There's nothing more to be done." Dot took the documents, feeling their weight in her hands. She had spent years allowing others to make the rules, to define her place in the family, but now she had written her own rules, and the consequences would follow. She sealed the envelope with a sharp snap, the sound echoing through the quiet room. The letter and the will were now set in motion, irrevocable, unchangeable. And as Dot held the sealed envelope in her hands, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't joy or relief, but something far quieter. A quiet satisfaction that she had finally taken control of her story. The world would know her now, not as an afterthought or a forgotten figure in the background, but as someone who had had the courage to act, to protect, and to defend her legacy. And that was enough. Lori's post appeared quietly on Facebook, as if it had been drafted weeks ago and simply waiting for the right moment to be shared. The screen lit up with the smiling faces of her family, and Dot knew instantly what it was. The holiday recap, the kind that was crafted carefully and shared with a deliberate, almost mechanical cheer. The photos were perfectly staged, and the captions all aimed at projecting an image of togetherness. It was the kind of image they all pretended to uphold, no matter what actually lay beneath. Dot didn't bother to check her own feed. She had never been one for social media, finding the self-congratulation and superficiality more exhausting than entertaining. But this was different. This post, this one, was designed to create a narrative, to make it seem like everything was fine, like the cranberry juice incident was just another funny holiday mishap to be laughed off. One of the photos showed Dot, mid-cleanup, holding a towel in her hand as she dabbed at the stain on her vintage cream dress. The expression on her face was calm, composed. She had always been composed, but now the image struck her as something far colder. A woman in the midst of an apology she had never asked for. The caption that accompanied the photo read, "Nana's vintage moment LOL, classic holiday fun, Sach Christmas memories, haar vintage vibes." Dot stared at the screen for a long time. The words stung in a way that surprised her. This wasn't the apology she had imagined. It wasn't a real apology at all. It was an attempt to bury the reality, to smooth over the rawness of what had happened with a perfect, sanitized smile. Lori had always been good at this, creating an image of perfection while avoiding the uncomfortable truths that lurked beneath. But this time, Dot wasn't going to let them hide behind their curated facade. Wes had been the first to call it out, of course. As always, he was watching, observing from his place across the street. His text was brief, but sharp, his words ringing with a truth that Dot felt deep in her bones. That photo says it all. Dot didn't need any further explanation. She could almost hear Wes's voice in the message, quiet but knowing, as always. It was an acknowledgement of the disrespect, of the way they had turned her moment of quiet indignation into a joke for their own amusement. Her fingers hovered over the screen of her phone as she read his message again. There was a moment of stillness, a breath before the next action. Then Dot opened her email and began typing, the words flowing quickly now, each one more deliberate than the last. Nina, add a printout of the photo to the file. It's important. She paused only long enough to check for any errors before sending it off. It wasn't just the photo itself that mattered, but what it represented. The lies, the misdirection, the manipulation. Dot had already made her final decisions. The will was signed, the letter sealed. But now, the EE world needed to know the truth, and she wasn't about to let anyone forget what had really happened. A few moments later, Nina's response arrived, succinct and efficient as always. Already done. Dot sat back, looking at the phone screen, her fingers still tingling with the sensation of the text that had just gone out. The weight of her next move wasn't lost on her. It felt almost too quiet, too calculated. Yet there was something deeply satisfying in how she had handled it. She hadn't risen to the bait. She hadn't lashed out in anger, though the temptation had been there. Instead, she had chosen to let them stew in their own carefully constructed image. Let them pretend. Let them play their part in their little charade. As the evening wore on, Dot's thoughts began to shift. She felt no satisfaction in the petty revenge of exposing their fake smiles. What she had done, what she was still doing, was about something far greater. It was about creating her own legacy, one that no amount of smiles or false apologies could erase. The night was deepening, and Dot was alone in the house, the sound of the wind outside the only noise. She stared out the window, across the street at Wes's house. She hadn't seen him that evening, hadn't spoken to him, but she knew he had been watching. He always was. She felt a sudden, quiet resolve settle within her. The letter, the will, the photo. It was all connected, each piece a marker in the path she had chosen to walk, and soon they would understand the consequences of their actions. Brian, Lori, none of them would walk away untouched. They would learn, slowly, that respect wasn't something you could just take when it suited you. And when they did finally come to understand, Dot would be long gone, her legacy already secured. With a slow, deliberate breath, Dot stood and moved toward the desk. She reached for the papers again, her fingers brushing the edges of the notarized documents. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The silence of the house wrapped around her, but this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt like the calm before the storm. The stage was set. Now the world would have to watch as the curtain rose on her final act. And for the first time in a long time, Dot felt something like peace. The message had been simple, sharp, and direct. Wes's words were always like that. A quiet observation, cutting through the noise and leaving only the raw truth behind. Dot had read it again and again. That photo says it all. She had known, even before he'd sent it, that he would see through it. The fake smiles, the subtle mockery of her. She had known that Wes, who had been watching from across the street, would be the one to call it out for what it truly was. The distance between them, while physical, had never been greater than it was in that moment. They understood each other, perhaps better than anyone else ever had. Dot grabbed her phone, her fingers moving swiftly over the screen. She snapped a screenshot of Wes's message and stared at the image for a long time, as though trying to imprint the reality of it into her mind. There was something incredibly satisfying about the finality of it, something about having a physical piece of evidence to back up her own conclusions. She saved the screenshot and then printed it. The soft hum of the printer in the background seemed to echo her steady heartbeat, a rhythm of precision, calmness, and inevitability. When the page emerged, crisp and final, she looked at it, folded it carefully, and date-stamped it. A record of the truth. She placed it in her filing cabinet, next to the other documents that were now part of her legacy, part of the truth she would leave behind. Dot reached for a small post-it note and wrote a single phrase in block letters. They always confirm it in writing. It wasn't just a reminder for herself, though that was part of it. It was a lesson, one she had learned over the years. People always made their intentions clear, even when they tried to hide them. And once they did, she could hold on to that clarity, could turn it into something far more useful than anger. She stuck the note to the side of her desk. It was small, unassuming, but it was the last thing she would see when she sat down to work, a reminder of the line she had drawn. The air in the room seemed to shift. Dot's gaze moved across the room to the desk where she had once signed her will and the letter. She could feel the weight of the decisions that had been made, and yet, there was still more to do. It wasn't over. Not yet. The protection of her legacy wasn't just about the will. It was about control. It was about making sure no one could slip through the cracks again. Wes had already agreed to help her with one part of the plan, something Dot had been meaning to address for years. The digital world had become just as important as the physical one, and if she was going to protect herself, her estate, and her future, then everything needed to be secured. Dot walked to the small office next to the kitchen. It was a room she had once used to manage the household, bank statements, bills, and notes about family gatherings. Now it was where she stored things that had more weight than financial documents, the legacy she was protecting. Her laptop sat on the desk and she powered it on. Within minutes, she was typing in passwords, navigating through the various accounts she had kept over the years, banking, investments, and personal files. She knew better than to let things go unchecked. She had seen enough people make that mistake, trusted too easily, and it had always been to their detriment. Wes arrived just as she was finishing up. His presence in the doorway was familiar and reassuring. He had been her closest confidant for years, always quiet, always observing, but never intrusive. Today, though, he was here for something more specific. "Everything set?" he asked, his voice low and steady as he stepped into the room. He glanced at the laptop screen and then at Dot, who was already moving to the next step. "Just about," Dot said, gesturing for him to sit. "I need to make some changes to my accounts. Lori, she's been on the medical proxy for too long." Wes nodded, understanding immediately. "You want her removed?" "Completely," Dot replied, her voice firm. "She doesn't have the right to make those decisions for me. She's not family anymore, not the way I need family to be." Wes didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. Instead, he stepped to the side, standing just behind Dot as she clicked through the system, navigating to the settings for her medical proxies, and designating a new person for that responsibility. Someone who would honor her wishes, not treat her life as another line on a ledger. He didn't ask who, but she knew it was the right choice. She'd made that decision already. Once that task was complete, Dot sighed, a small sound of relief escaping her lips. "Done," she said, closing the laptop with a finality that felt almost like the closing of a door. Wes stepped back, his face neutral, but his eyes held something that Dot had long since come to recognize: approval, not for what had been done, but for the decisiveness with which it had been executed. "You've covered your bases," he said simply. "I'm not taking any chances," Dot replied. "I'm not going to be erased." She sat at her desk, the weight of everything she had just done pressing on her in a way she had not anticipated. For the first time in a long time, it felt as though she had both the power and the responsibility for the direction her legacy would take. She wasn't leaving it to chance, to others' whims or neglect. It was hers to define, and no one, least of all Lori and Brian, would take that from her. "I've had Nina draft an advance directive," Dot said suddenly, breaking the silence between them. She had asked Nina to do it earlier, something firm, something definitive, in case there were any questions about her wishes later. Wes nodded. Good. It's important. Dot looked at the papers scattered across the desk, the weight of each decision anchored in the present. She wasn't just preparing to leave something behind, she was ensuring her place in the world, making it clear who she was, who she had been, and who she would always be, no matter what anyone else thought. The line was drawn, and nothing, not even time, would erase it. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint golden light through the kitchen window. Dot stood by the counter, her hands moving slowly, deliberately, as she prepared 2 cups of coffee. The house was still quiet, the only sound the soft hiss of the kettle and the rhythmic clink of porcelain. There was something about the stillness in the morning that always made her feel more certain of her decisions. This was when clarity often came, before the world demanded anything of her. She poured the coffee carefully, the steam rising in delicate spirals, filling the room with a rich, comforting scent. Dot set the cups down on the table in front of the window, each one placed just so, as if she were setting the stage for something important. James was always the last to wake up, lingering in his bedroom until the house had settled. This morning was no different. She could hear him shuffling down the hallway, his footsteps lazy and unhurried. He appeared in the doorway, his face unshaven, eyes still heavy with sleep. He looked like he hadn't slept much the night before. His usual mask of exhaustion settled over him. "Morning," Dot said, her voice steady as she gestured to the cup of coffee in front of his seat. He didn't reply immediately, just sat down with a quiet grunt. He ran a hand through his hair, pulling the strands back as if trying to gather his thoughts, but there was no real rush in him. Dot knew that about James. He had always been slow to react, avoiding confrontation whenever possible. But today would be different. Today, the silence would no longer be allowed to stretch between them. She sat across from him, folding her hands on the table. The coffee between them felt like a barrier, a surface that separated them both from what needed to be said. "James," she began, her voice softer than it had been the night before. "Why didn't you say anything when it happened?" He looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. The question hung in the air, not accusatory, but still carrying the weight of something deeper. "I didn't want to cause a scene," he mumbled, his gaze drifting to the window, where the last traces of dawn were fading. Dot's fingers tightened around her own cup, the warmth of it offering no comfort at all. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "That's what silence always does," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Nothing." James looked at her now, his expression a mix of uncertainty and guilt. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, he took a sip of his coffee, his gaze drifting away again. Dot waited, her patience steady. She could feel the weight of the moment. It was a strange thing, waiting for someone to finally see the truth you had known for years. The truth that had been hidden in plain sight, buried under layers of pretense and avoidance. Finally, she spoke again, softer this time but with a firmness that cut through the air. "You saw what happened, didn't you? You saw Brian's disrespect, the way he laughed, the way Lori turned her back. And you said nothing." James shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting with the handle of his coffee cup. I don't know what to say, Mom. It's just family stuff. You know how they are." Dot's lips tightened. "I know exactly how they are. But you, James, you've never been able to see it. You've let them walk all over you for years, and now you're doing the same to me." He winced at the words, but Dot wasn't finished. She reached into the drawer beside her and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The crispness of it mirrored the sharpness of her resolve. "Read this," she said, handing it to him. "Then decide what kind of son you want to be." James looked down at the letter in his hands, his fingers brushing the edges of the paper. The familiar weight of it, the words he had never seen, the truth she had written for him. He knew it was coming. He had seen the way she had been changing in recent months, had felt the subtle shift in the air whenever they gathered, but he had never expected this. "I don't understand," he said softly, though the uncertainty in his voice told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't ready to face what was in front of him. Not yet. Not the way she had been. Dot watched him, her gaze steady and unyielding. She had spent a lifetime being silent, waiting for him to step up, to show that he cared enough to fight for what was right. But this time, she wasn't going to wait anymore. This was it. The line had been drawn, and now it was his turn to decide whether he would step across it, or remain where he had always been. James opened the letter, his brow furrowing as his eyes scanned the words. Dot didn't speak, didn't urge him on. She let him read, let him process it in his own time. When he finished, the silence stretched between them again. But it was different now. It wasn't a silence born from avoidance. It was a silence pregnant with possibility. Dot's voice broke the stillness. "This is your chance, James. You don't have to stand by and let them walk all over you anymore. You can choose. What kind of son do you want to be?" He looked up at her then, his eyes searching hers as if trying to find the answer there. For the first time, Dot saw something in him. A flicker of understanding, a flicker of responsibility. I don't know yet, Mom," he said, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful. "But I'll think about it." Dot nodded, her heart heavier than she'd expected. She hadn't expected an immediate change, but there was something in his words that told her this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. As he stood up, ready to leave, Dot's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer. She hadn't given him an easy choice. She hadn't offered forgiveness on a silver platter. But she had given him something far more valuable: the truth, and the opportunity to choose who he wanted to be. And that, Dot knew, was the greatest gift she could give him. The morning sun had long since risen, flooding the house with a light that felt almost too warm. Dot stood at the kitchen counter, the weight of the day's task heavy in the air. The will was already sitting on the table before her, folded neatly, its contents now rewritten with a finality that couldn't be undone. The ink was fresh, the decisions made. But something still lingered in the back of her mind, something that told her the job wasn't quite finished. Dot had done what she could to secure her legacy, to protect the things that truly mattered. But there was still the matter of ensuring that no one could challenge her decisions. She needed to be certain that this time her family couldn't weasel their way in, couldn't make a mockery of her choices the way they had in the past. With a deliberate breath, she reached for the file on the table, flipping it open to the newly printed document. Her hand moved to the next step in the process, the no contest clause. Her fingers traced the bolded words on the cover sheet as she placed it on top of the will, making sure it was clearly visible. No contest clause enforced. She smiled to herself, the feeling of satisfaction rising in her chest. The clause was simple, yet powerful. Any attempt to contest the will would result in automatic disinheritance. There would be no back and forth, no long drawn-out legal battles. If they dared to challenge it, they would lose everything. The thought of Brian or Lori trying to fight their way back into her estate filled her with a cold, sharp thrill. With a steady hand, Dot signed the document again, sealing the fate of her family and her legacy. It wasn't just a will anymore. It was a statement, a declaration of intent. She wasn't just protecting herself. She was sending a message that would echo through the halls of the courthouse and into her family's history. Disrespect will have consequences. Dot stood up from the table, her chair scraping softly against the floor. She moved to the hallway, past the family photos, past the long corridors that had once been full of noise and laughter, noise that had always felt like it was just a little too hollow, just a little too self-serving. She made her way to the front door, grabbing the keys to her car from the hook beside the door. She wasn't just delivering this will to Nina today. She wasn't just handing it over to have it filed away. Today, she was taking it straight to the county office herself. She needed to know, without a shadow of a doubt, that this will would be recorded and recognized by the people who mattered most. The ones who would ensure that nothing would get lost in the shuffle of legal bureaucracy. The drive to the office was quick, but Dot couldn't help but notice how everything felt different. The trees lining the streets, the houses she passed, even the light itself seemed to carry a kind of certainty now. She wasn't rushing to fix anything anymore. She wasn't scrambling to cover her tracks or worry about what they thought of her. She was simply taking the steps that needed to be taken, one after the other, until there was nothing left to do but wait for the inevitable. At the county office, Dot handed the sealed documents over to the clerk, her voice calm, steady as she explained what needed to be done. The clerk took the papers without question, looking them over briefly before stamping them with the official seal. Dot watched the motion of the stamp, the way it pressed down with finality. She didn't need to watch for long. She knew the process well enough by now. The clerk handed her a receipt, confirming that the will was now filed and secured. Dot tucked it into her bag with the kind of satisfaction that only comes from knowing that what you've done can't be undone. When she returned home, she didn't feel the weight of the day's decisions pressing down on her as she had before. Instead, there was an odd peace, a sense that something had been set right in a way she couldn't explain, but could deeply feel. The final act had been performed, and she wasn't finished yet. Dot moved to her safe in the study, its steel door cold and unyielding beneath her fingers as she turned the dial with practiced ease. She opened it, took the will, the letter, and the receipt from the county office, and placed them inside, marking them clearly. Then, without a second thought, she turned and grabbed the final copy, the one that was to go to Wes. He had been there for her through everything. More than just a neighbor, more than just a friend. He had quietly observed, quietly understood, and quietly protected her when she couldn't do it for herself. Now, she was returning the favor. She placed the copy of the will, marked for Wes, inside an envelope. Before she could close the safe, she heard the familiar sound of the front door opening, followed by the soft shuffle of footsteps down the hallway. Wes was here, just like he always was when it counted. He stepped into the room, looking at her without saying a word. He didn't need to. His gaze said it all. He was here to help, as always. Dot held out the envelope to him without a word. Wes took it with a nod, his hands steady as he slipped the envelope into his coat pocket. "This isn't just revenge," he said quietly, his voice as steady as ever. Dot smiled. A small but knowing smile. "No, it's correction." Wes didn't ask any more questions. He simply nodded again and turned to leave, his footsteps soft against the hardwood floors. Dot closed the safe, the weight of everything she had done settling into her bones. It wasn't over. Not yet. But now it was only a matter of time before they would understand. And for the first time in a long time, Dot felt the truth settle deep within her. She had drawn the line. Now it was their turn to decide whether they would cross it. The phone call had come in late the night before, Laurie's voice dripping with false cheer as it always did. Dot had caught the tail end of the conversation as it floated into the kitchen. Laurie was speaking to a cousin, one of those relatives who was always on the fringes of their family, invited only to fill seats at holidays and give the occasional wave of support. "Well, I've already set aside a down payment for the sale of the house," Laurie had said, her tone casual, but Dot could hear the thread of greed beneath it. "When it's time, of course, I'll be ready to move quickly, you know? Just making sure I'm prepared. Wouldn't want to miss out on the opportunity." Dot didn't flinch. She didn't need to. Laurie's assumption that the house would simply be hers to sell The inheritance that Dot had worked her whole life for, just handed over, was everything Dot had expected. Lori had been eyeing her property for years, waiting for the inevitable moment when Dot's decline would make the transfer official. It had never occurred to Lori that Dot might have a different plan. Dot had seen through it all. The polite smiles, the little comments about how hard it must be for you to manage everything on your own, always veiled in an interest that was far too focused on the future than the present. Dot's lips curled into a faint smile, but she said nothing. Let Lori think she was playing the game. Let her assume that Dot didn't know exactly what was happening. The real play wasn't in the house, it was in the will, and the game had already shifted. A few days later, Brian stopped by, as he often did, with the same entitled attitude he had displayed since childhood. He wasn't here for anything meaningful. He never was. But the moment he stepped through the door, he was already angling for what he thought was his. "Hey, Nana," he greeted her with a half-hearted attempt at a smile, his eyes already scanning the room as though looking for something he could claim. "When you're done with that car of yours, I was thinking it might be nice to take it off your hands. It's a great ride, and you don't really need it anymore, right?" Dot stared at him for a moment, her fingers tightening around the coffee cup in front of her. His words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. He was already planning her death, already assuming that her belongings would become his, like everything else had always been. It was the same sense of ownership, that same entitlement. But Dot wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of even a response. She laughed softly, the sound more bitter than light-hearted. "You'll have to wait a long time for that, Brian." She said nothing more. He was used to her silence, but today it was different. Today, her silence was its own answer, its own verdict. He didn't deserve an explanation. She wouldn't give him one. Later, Nina called, her voice brisk but friendly, as always. "Dot, I've been thinking about the car situation. Want to pre-transfer it in case you want to get everything squared away now? It'll save time when the paperwork needs to go through." Dot didn't hesitate. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady and decisive, but to someone who drives with respect. There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. Dot knew Nina understood exactly what she meant. "Understood," Nina said, her voice the epitome of professionalism. "I'll make sure it's all taken care of properly." Dot felt a wave of satisfaction settle over her. The car wasn't for Brian, wasn't for Lori, or anyone else who thought they could inherit what wasn't theirs. It would go to someone who truly valued the responsibility it entailed. No more entitlement. No more assumptions. The next few weeks passed quickly, with one small victory after another. The museum had agreed to take her antique dish collection, despite the occasional murmurs about how much it would be worth to collectors. Dot hadn't cared about their worth for years. It wasn't about money, it was about preserving the past, the legacy, the memories tied to each piece. She had given it all to the local preservation society, ensuring that it would be kept intact for future generations to appreciate, not sold for someone's fleeting gain. And the dress, her beloved dress, the one ruined by Brian's thoughtless spill, was no longer just a personal memento. Dot had donated it to a textile exhibit, juice stain and all. It would be displayed for what it truly was, a symbol of grace in the face of disrespect. The stain wasn't an imperfection, it was a story, one that would live on, a piece of history for anyone who cared to look. Dot sat down one evening, the quiet of the house wrapping around her as she looked over the final arrangements, the legalities, the belongings, the decisions, all made and sealed. The line had been drawn and everything was in place. Her legacy was hers alone to control now. No one would walk in and take it, no matter how much they expected it. She poured herself a glass of wine, the rich red liquid swirling in the glass as she raised it toward the empty room. To correction. she murmured softly, a small but fierce smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't just revenge. It was something deeper, something more powerful. It was the quiet, deliberate reclaiming of her life, and for the first time in a long time, Dot felt a sense of peace settle within her. The small, unassuming textile exhibit had never seen such a crowd. Dot had been there once before, during a quiet showing of local craftsmanship. The space, filled with muted colors and soft light, was always calming, a testament to the art of preservation. But today, it had become something much more than that. The dress, her beloved cream-colored silk gown, stood center stage under a glass display. It was framed delicately in the quiet elegance of the exhibit. But there was something undeniably striking about it now. The stain, bright, bold, and unmistakable, was no longer a sign of failure or carelessness. It had become part of the story, a piece of history no one could ignore. The label beneath the display read, "A Grandmother's Silence." Dot stood back at the edge of the room, watching the visitors as they took in the sight, their eyes lingering over the details of the dress. The way it had been expertly arranged, the stain left untouched, the fabric now a symbol of something deeper. It was more than just a dress. It was a statement, a legacy, a reminder that what had happened was no accident, and it was no small thing. As the visitors whispered among themselves, the whispers began to swell. The story of the dress, and the story behind it, was circulating like wildfire. It didn't take long before the local reporter arrived, her camera clicking quietly as she approached Dot. The woman was familiar, a part of the community, and she had always known Dot to be a quiet, steadfast figure. But today, the air between them was charged with something different, something unspoken. "Mrs. Carlin," the reporter greeted her, adjusting her glasses as she smiled warmly. "I have to say, this is a fascinating exhibit. A Grandmother's Silence. It's such a powerful title. May I ask you a few questions about the piece?" Dot took a moment, letting the question hang in the air as she glanced back at the dress, the stain standing out even more in the lighting. She could see people stopping, reading, talking among themselves. This was bigger than just a local interest story. This was a story that had to be told. "Of course," Dot said, her voice calm and even, like everything she had done had led to this moment. "What would you like to know?" The reporter nodded, clicking her pen to take notes. "I understand this dress belonged to you. But the stain, it's such a striking detail. Why leave it? What's the significance of it?" Dot paused, giving the reporter a long look. She knew the question would come, and she had already prepared her answer. "It's a part of the story," she said simply, her gaze unwavering. "That stain marks a moment of disrespect. It was a moment when I was made to feel invisible, when my value was disregarded. But I decided not to hide it, not to erase it, because it's a part of who I am. It's a part of what I've lived through. And that's what I wanted to leave behind." The reporter scribbled down the words quickly, her eyes flicking back to Dot, intrigued by the quiet strength that radiated from her. "So this was an act of defiance?" she asked, her tone a mixture of curiosity and admiration. Dot's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "No, it's not defiance. It's correction. I wasn't going to let them take what was mine without acknowledging the truth. And I wasn't going to let them think they could erase me." The reporter nodded, her pen moving faster now, capturing Dot's words like they were precious artifacts, waiting to be preserved. That evening, the article appeared in the local paper. The headline screamed out to anyone who cared to read it: "Cranberry and Consequence, a grandmother's silence speaks louder than words." Dot knew it would go viral in their town, and it didn't take long before the gossip began to spread like wildfire. People talked, they shared the story on social media, and before long, even the local news picked it up. A grandmother, standing firm in the face of disrespect, turning a simple mishap into a powerful statement about legacy and dignity. But not everyone was pleased. Of course, Dot knew they wouldn't be. Brian was the first to respond, or, rather, the first to retreat. Dot noticed within hours that his social media accounts had gone dark. His photos disappeared, his status updates ceased, and his presence faded from the digital world. She could only imagine the conversations that were happening behind the scenes, the defensiveness, the resentment building inside him. He had thought it would all be his. He had expected that his entitlement to Dot's estate was a foregone conclusion. Lori, on the other hand, took a different approach. She faked confusion, posting a long, drawn-out message on Facebook, acting as though she had no idea why the situation had spiraled so far. "I didn't think it was that deep," she wrote, with a string of laughing emojis to keep up the charade. "Nana's always been a little dramatic. Haha. But we're family, right?" Dot read it, her lips curling slightly in amusement. She didn't respond, not publicly. Instead, she allowed the words to sink in, to settle into the world where they belonged. It wasn't her job to explain herself to them anymore. The truth was out there, for anyone who cared to see it. She thought about it for a moment before typing a single line in response, a message that was so simple, so true, it didn't need any more explanation. "You rarely do." Dot didn't bother to check the likes, the comments, or the shares. She didn't need to. The message had been received, loud and clear. She wasn't fading into the background any longer. She had spoken her truth, and the world would know it. For the first time in a long time, Dot felt something stir deep inside her. Peace. Her silence had spoken louder than anything else ever could. Now it was their turn to listen, and that, she knew, would be their real punishment. The morning was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt almost reverent, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Dot sat at her kitchen table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The will was in the drawer beside her, her final decision sealed and in place. She'd felt no need for further explanation or discussion, but even as she sat there, a sense of unease was quietly creeping up the back of her neck. She knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before someone tried to challenge her decisions. She just hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Her phone buzzed on the table, the name on the screen making her pause for a moment before she answered. It was Nina, calling with a tone that immediately told Dot something was off. "Dot, I need you to listen carefully." Nina's voice was low, almost urgent. "There's been an attempt to impersonate you. Someone tried to call and get information on the will, acting like they were you." Dot felt her chest tighten, but she kept her voice steady. "Lori?" Nina didn't hesitate. "Yes. She's been calling the office, asking questions, trying to get a copy of the will. She didn't even disguise it very well. She used your name, said she was handling some details, that it was a matter of urgency." Dot's grip on her phone tightened. Lori was desperate, trying to claw back what she thought was still hers, trying to take control over something she had no right to. It was pathetic, but not surprising. "Don't worry," Nina continued, her tone even more measured now. "I flagged the call the moment it came through. It's recorded, and I've marked it in the system. We're not going to let her get away with this." Dot exhaled slowly, the weight of Nina's words sinking in. She didn't feel anger, not the way most would. Instead, it was something colder, something calmer, a quiet resolve that had been building in her for years. She was done. There would be no more compromises, no more second chances. "Good," Dot said, her voice firm. "Now take care of it. Send her a cease and desist. I want this to be clear." "I'll handle it," Nina assured her, already sounding like she was drafting the letter in her mind. "You don't have to worry about a thing." Dot hung up, but the unease remained. She didn't trust Lori, didn't trust her to just go away quietly. It was one thing to ignore a mistake. It was another to actively try to erase someone's hard-earned choices. Dot had expected some resistance, but this felt different. Lori was reaching for something she had no claim to, and now Dot had to make sure she understood that her actions would have consequences. She stood up from the table, the need for action pulling her away from the quiet peace that had settled in her home. She walked to the kitchen counter and began pulling out the ingredients for a pie. A simple gesture, a calming one, something she had always done when she needed time to think. Dot worked with slow, practiced motions as the scent of apples and cinnamon filled the air. This was a moment of clarity, of grounding herself in the familiar as everything else around her seemed to unravel. As the pie baked, Dot's mind stayed focused. She could picture Lori, sitting somewhere, pacing perhaps, trying to figure out how she had messed up. It wouldn't be long before the cease and desist arrived at her door. Lori would see the weight of her mistake, but Dot knew she wouldn't stop there. She couldn't afford to. The pie was finished just as the sun began to set, the crust golden and inviting. Dot placed it on the cooling rack, breathing in the smell that was as comforting to her as any remedy. The sound of her phone vibrating again broke the silence. She picked it up, seeing a new message from Nina. "The cease and desist is in the mail. I've also added a legal note to her file. She won't be able to get far with this. You'll be covered." Dot read the message, her lips curving into a faint, knowing smile. There would be no more back and forth, no more quiet pretensions. The line had been drawn, and there would be no erasing it. Lori would learn, as would everyone else, that Dot was not someone to be underestimated anymore. The doorbell rang. Dot's gaze shifted toward the front of the house. She didn't need to check the clock. She knew who it was. Lori, probably in a panic, thinking there was still a chance to fix things, to turn the tide in her favor. But there was nothing to fix. It was done. Dot stood still for a moment, the quiet of the house enveloping her once again. She could feel it now, that finality settling in. The pie, cooling on the counter, was a small comfort. It didn't matter what Lori had to say anymore. It didn't matter what Brian or anyone else had to say. Dot had done what needed to be done. The world would keep turning. But for the first time, Dot knew it would turn on her terms. She turned, grabbed the handle of the door, and opened it. Lori stood there, her eyes wide with something between confusion and desperation. Dot simply raised an eyebrow. "I suggest you read the letter, Lori, then decide what kind of person you want to be." Lori blinked, but Dot had already turned back to the counter, where the pie was waiting for her. She had already made her choice. Now it was time for Lori to make hers. And Dot had no intention of waiting any longer. The sky outside was clouded, a dull gray that stretched on for miles. Dot stood by the window, her gaze focused on the vast expanse of her garden, the only part of the world she had ever truly been able to control. The wind was light, the air fresh with the promise of change. Dot hadn't expected to feel so calm after everything she'd set in motion, after the lies, the betrayals, the silent disregard from her own flesh and blood. But now, in the stillness of her home, she felt a sense of quiet victory, as though she had done everything she could to make sure no one could take what was hers. The will was in her hands once again. She had reviewed it for what seemed like the 100th time. Everything was in place, everything as it should be. But there was one more thing to be done. One more change that had to be made. Dot reached for her pen, the ink heavy in her fingers, as she opened to the page where James's name was written as the backup trustee. She had always thought he would be the one to take over in the event of her passing. After all, he was her son. He should have been the one to carry on the responsibility. But his lack of action, his inability to speak up when it mattered, had shown her the truth. He wasn't the person she had hoped for him to be. He wasn't capable of taking control. He had chosen the silence, the inaction, and that choice, in the end, had cost him. With a smooth, deliberate stroke of the pen, Dot crossed his name out. She didn't feel any regret, no hesitation. This was not about punishment. It was about correction. It was about choosing someone who would honor the legacy, someone who could be trusted. She wrote Wes's name beneath the line where James's had once been. Wes, who had been a steady presence in her life for as long as she could remember. He understood what it meant to care for something, to take responsibility. He had always been there, always watched over the things that mattered. New trustee, Wes Grant. And then, the backup. She thought about it for a moment. She could have left it blank, let the future take care of itself. But she didn't want to leave anything to chance, not after everything. She trusted Nina. She had for years, and Nina's office would be the perfect safeguard. It wasn't just about having someone there for the technicalities. It was about having someone who would follow her wishes to the letter. Backup trustee, Nina Patterson, professional fiduciary. Dot sat back, her hand still resting on the paper, as though the words would shift if she let go too soon. The house was silent again, the weight of her decision settling into her chest like an anchor. The finality of it all was more than just legal paperwork. It was a declaration, a statement. She had drawn the line. Now it was time for others to understand that line. Weeks passed in a quiet blur, but Dot wasn't the type to forget. She had the satisfaction of knowing that everything she had planned was falling into place. It didn't hurt that the final decisions were so satisfying, so necessary. But there was more still to come. Brian had been quiet, almost too quiet. Dot hadn't heard from him directly, but she had seen the whispers in the digital world, the same world he had always lived in. His social media accounts had gone silent, his usual posts replaced by a thick cloud of absence. It wasn't long before she learned why. Brian had received a rejection letter from the college he had applied to. Not just because of his grades, but because of something more serious: misconduct. The very thing that Dot had always suspected but never wanted to admit. He had been caught, and his actions were now following him. The rejection letter was a direct result of notes filed by his school, notes that were now a part of his permanent record. Dot didn't gloat, didn't send any messages of, "I told you so." Instead, she did what she had planned all along. She had set aside a portion of her estate for something greater than herself, something that would last far longer than any house or car. She had decided to fund a scholarship, one that would ensure future generations learned the value of respect, of responsibility, and of integrity. It was named after her late husband, the man who had always understood what it meant to live with honor. She could still hear his voice, steady and sure as he had once told her. Legacy isn't built on wealth, Dot. It's built on what you leave behind in others. The Charles Carlin Integrity Grant would fund students who upheld the values she had spent her life fighting for. Those who showed respect for others, who never let entitlement overshadow humility, and who took responsibility when it mattered most. A few days after the scholarship was set up, Dot received a call from Nina, her voice professional but edged with something warmer than usual. "Dot, there's a student, a bright one. I think this could be the first recipient of the grant. I've already spoken with the administration, they're on board. This could be the start of something important." Dot didn't need to ask for more details. She had set the stage. Now it was up to others to rise to the occasion. Dot sat back in her chair, her fingers resting lightly on the papers in front of her. The future was still uncertain, still fragile in some ways. But for the first time in years, she felt as if she was holding it in her hands. There was no turning back now. The choices had been made, and the legacy was set. The world would remember the name Carlin, not for the money or the property, but for the integrity she had instilled, for the lessons she had fought to pass on. Her story would live on, and in the end, it would be her version of the truth that was remembered. And for that, Dot felt a deep, profound peace. The phone remained silent after Laurie's message, and Dot didn't respond. There was nothing to say. She had said everything she needed to, had drawn her line in the sand so clearly that nothing more could be added. Laurie's confusion, her half-hearted pleas, her attempts to diminish what had happened, it all faded into the background of Dot's life, as it had always done. She didn't respond because there was no point in responding. There was no more energy to waste on people who couldn't hear, couldn't understand the weight of what had been said without words. Her silence now was a kind of armor. It didn't need to be filled with anything else. The only thing Dot allowed herself to feel in this moment was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the legacy she had worked for, fought for, was no longer in anyone else's hands. It was hers. And now, it would endure. She stood up, looking out the window at the fading afternoon light. Her house, so full of history, of memories both painful and beautiful, felt like the perfect place to close the door on one chapter and step into another. She was done. And as she looked at the old, worn furniture, the heirlooms that had always been part of her life, she realized that she could still shape her world, even in the silence. That evening, Dot drove to the mall. The city had started to fade into the cool evening, the streets quieter now as the sun dipped low. She moved among the aisles, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead the only sound. It was a normal trip, one she had made countless times before, but today, everything felt different. She wasn't looking for something she had to have, wasn't searching for a replacement or a fix. She was looking for something new, something just for her. When she found it, the navy blue dress seemed to leap out from the rack, elegant in its simplicity. The fabric shimmered just so, a deep, steady blue that matched the peace she felt inside. A dress that wouldn't require any explanation, that wouldn't be scrutinized or judged by anyone else's standards. A dress she could wear for no one but herself. She tried it on in the changing room. It fit perfectly. The dress was soft against her skin, and for the first time in a long time, she felt comfortable, at ease. The fabric swirled around her as she moved, the clean lines of it flattering in a way she hadn't expected. She stared at herself in the mirror, not just at the dress, but at the woman standing there. She was different now. There was something undeniably final in her reflection, something undeniable about the way she stood. Self-assured, unapologetic, and at peace. She bought the dress. Then, with the dress bag hanging from her arm, she made her way to her favorite quiet spot, the small cafe just down the road. It was always the same. No crowds, no rush, no need for anything more than a cup of coffee and a quiet corner. She slipped into a seat by the window, the light of the late afternoon falling in slanted bars across the table. She ordered a small lunch, a simple bowl of soup, and as she sat there, alone with her thoughts, she realized how much she had missed this. The stillness, the quiet satisfaction of just being. It was a luxury to sit with herself, to no longer be swept away by the noise of the world around her, to not have to prove herself to anyone. When the waiter brought the check, Dot noticed the familiar gesture she always made. She had never been one to skimp on tips, but today, it felt different. As she looked at the total, her eyes glanced at the waiter's face, and something in her stirred. She slid a generous tip across the table. More than usual. Enough to make a difference, even if just for today. The waiter smiled gratefully, and Dot's heart warmed just slightly. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because she could. because she had the power to make someone else's day a little bit easier, a little bit brighter. It was the smallest of gestures, but in this moment it felt like a reflection of the changes she had made in her own life. Small, but meaningful. The sun was lower now as she left the cafe, the last traces of the golden hour still hanging in the air. She felt a strange sense of fulfillment, like she had completed something important, something that no one could take from her. She wasn't running from anything anymore. She wasn't hiding. Later that evening, she sat at her desk and opened the safe one last time. The papers, the final estate documents, were neatly filed. It was time to close the chapter, to move everything into its place, where it would remain undisturbed. She signed the final pages, confirming her intentions, securing her future and her legacy. When she was finished, she set the papers down and closed the safe with a quiet, final click. Dot moved to the kitchen, the familiar scent of cinnamon and sugar filling the air. She hadn't baked in a long time, but tonight, there was something about the act of creating something from scratch, of giving a little piece of herself to the people she cared for. She baked a batch of cookies, simple, warm, sweet, for Wes. She wrapped them carefully, placed them in a small box, and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the cookies as they cooled. The warmth of the kitchen felt like the last act of something finished, a life lived fully, a story told, a legacy set in place. And as she sat there, Dot knew the world would continue to turn, and she would remain, the quiet architect of her own fate. She had drawn the line. Now all that was left was for everyone to realize it. The small chapel was quiet, far quieter than Dot would have ever expected. There were no flowers, no grand displays, no ostentatious gestures. It was simple, dignified, just as she had requested. The only people present were the few who truly mattered, the ones who had known her not as a figure to be inherited, but as a person to be respected. Nina sat in the front row, her presence a solid comfort, a silent ally in the sea of awkwardness. The rest of the room was filled with faces that Dot had known for years, neighbors, a handful of old friends, even a few people who had worked for the family over the years. But there were no grand gestures, there were no relatives making grand speeches. That was Dot's final wish, to keep it simple, to keep it quiet, to leave behind the world she had created without the fanfare she'd never needed. Brian and Lori sat together in the second row, their faces frozen, expressions tight with barely contained confusion. The article, the will, the public display of Dot's intentions. It was all unfolding in real time for them, and their discomfort was palpable. They had thought it would be easy. They had thought Dot would fade into the background, her wealth and legacy slipping into their hands like a foregone conclusion. They hadn't anticipated the letter. The moment came when Nina stood, stepping to the podium to read the words Dot had left behind. The room quieted, a collective breath held as Nina began reading, her voice steady and calm as she read every word of Dot's letter aloud. To my dear son James, my daughter-in-law Lori, and my grandson Brian, I've spent my life building a legacy, not for those who would take, but for those who would honor it. To you, Brian and Lori, I leave nothing. You have shown time and again that you value ownership over respect, and there is no place for that in my legacy. To my son James, who chose silence when action was needed, I leave him only the chance to reflect. I hope that, in time, you understand the importance of respect, the currency of legacy. But for now, that's all I can leave you with. A lesson, not a fortune. Dot's words floated in the air, heavier now than they had ever been. Lori's face tightened, her hand reaching for Brian's. She looked up at him, but he seemed incapable of looking back. Brian didn't react. Not yet. But there was a shift in the air, an undeniable weight hanging over him. Lori's eyes darted between Nina and the document, her lips pressed into a thin line as if trying to hold back a wave of indignation she didn't know how to express. The room remained still, save for Nina's voice continuing, reaching the part Dot had penned with so much clarity. To my dear neighbor, Wes Grant, I leave the responsibility of carrying my legacy forward. I trust that he will preserve the things that matter, not for profit, but for what they mean. And to Riley, a student who has shown the qualities I hold most dear, I leave the Charles Carlin Integrity Grant to help guide you in a life of respect and dignity, just as I hope my grandson Brian one day learns to. Dot's voice, even in death, was the loudest one in the room. And Brian, who had thought this would be an easy inheritance, sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing, his face growing pale as the truth of it settled in. Laurie's expression faltered for the first time, the mask slipping as the real consequences of Dot's decisions began to take hold. The letter, in all its finality, had stripped them of their assumptions. And as the last words fell from Nina's lips, the air felt heavy, filled with something like grief. Perhaps for the loss of their expectations, or perhaps for the final severing of a relationship they had long assumed would always exist. Brian looked down at the ground, the weight of everything hitting him all at once. Dot had never spoken with such clarity before. She had always been so controlled, so careful. But this was the truth laid bare for everyone to see. James sat still in the back row, his head tilted slightly, his gaze focused on the ground. When the last words of the letter were read, a tear slid down his face, unnoticed by everyone but Dot, who would have recognized that tear for what it was. A quiet regret. It was the first real emotion he'd shown, the first time he'd allowed himself to acknowledge that perhaps the silence, the inaction, had been a mistake. It was too little too late. But for a moment, Dot allowed herself to feel some sympathy for him. He hadn't understood, not until now, and it was that truth that would weigh on him for the rest of his life. The lawyer, standing at the side, cleared his throat, and the moment of tension broke, replaced by the inevitable, the delivery of the final pages. He stepped forward, handing Dot's trusted lawyer, Nina, the final documents. The lawyer confirmed, aloud and officially, the disinheritance, confirming the full implications of Dot's final will. Everything has been executed according to her wishes, he said, his voice flat and professional, as though the emotional storm that had just passed was none of his concern. A few weeks later, the first check from the Charles Carlin Integrity Grant was handed to Riley, a bright student, someone who had earned her place by demonstrating the respect and dignity Dot had always cherished. The scholarship would not only provide for her future, but would live on as a living testament to Dot's legacy. Dot's story had been told, and the world was beginning to understand what she had fought for. It was more than money, more than property. It was about the things that could never be bought: integrity, respect, and legacy. Dot Carlin's name would not fade into the background. It would be remembered for the lessons she left behind, for the people who truly mattered, and for the silent strength that would carry her legacy for generations to come. And for the first time in a long time, Dot felt the peace she had earned. My grandson poured juice on my dress at Christmas. I poured the truth into the will.